Grab a cup of your favorite beverage and join us for this week's webinar, September 25th, 2020. Welcome to the September 25th edition of the REIndicator webinar. We have the largest number of folks pre-registering for this so far, so we're really glad that this is starting to get some momentum. And as you'll notice, over the next couple of webinars, there's going to be new features in the system that are going to be released, and you're definitely going to want to take advantage of being on the webinars or listen to them as quickly as you can afterwards to take advantage of those new features. So I'm going to use the webinars as a way to help everybody have more familiarity with the new features that are on the way. Might have a little bit of dark circles under my eyes as I've been working very hard to get all the data pulled together and culled together for the new release. We wanted to get it out this month, and I'm still hoping that it will still say September when we release it. That's my goal. I hope we can meet that goal. So what I would like to do is remind everybody at the top what we're trying to do with the webinars, because there might be some folks on here who have not been with us before. So just a quick review of things. First of all, the main purpose of the webinar is to make sure everybody can have an opportunity to ask questions and allow me to answer them in a way that you can have a follow-up question. We can live demonstrate for you on the system so that you can see and figure it out. And then by asking in this group environment, other people can benefit from hearing that idea. So feel free to raise your hand and ask to speak. In the lower left of your control panel, you should have a raise your hand to speak, and we can add your voice to the call today. Or if you prefer, just type in your question or comment or topic you'd like me to discuss in more detail, and I'll be watching those very closely to make sure that we get those information items out to everybody on the webinar. The second purpose we have this is to keep you up to date as the latest that we've been doing here to pull together new data and or new capabilities in the system so that you're fully aware of what's coming, what's available right now, and how to make the best use of it. The third item is to try to just have a brief review of where the economy is and where it seems to be headed, so that we can all collectively understand where we are in the process of markets being in different stages, buyers one, buyers two, sellers one, sellers two. We're going to get into a lot more detail on that as we go into our webinars right after our launch of the new stuff that's coming out very soon. There's going to be a whole phase where we're going to actually revisit the entire market cycles module and allow you to have more data on that. So very excited about that. But we'll be digging into that in greater depth in not too far off webinars. So if you want to mark your calendars to be ready to go for the webinars, I've got them charted out for the rest of the year. In October, there are two of them. That's the 9th and the 23rd. We will continue to post these on the main page of REIndicator when you sign in. And what we'll probably do is move that to a little function later this year. So you can just click on the webinars and there'll be a schedule there so that you won't have to have those little warnings that are coming up in the beginning of your system. But that's all happening right now, so you won't see it for a little bit, but working on that. So October 9 and 23, those are Fridays at 2 p.m. They're all going to be Fridays at 2 p.m. on the East Coast as the clock reads for the rest of the year at least. So in November will be 6 and 20, and December will be 4 and 18. Every other Friday, October 9, October 23, November 6, November 20, and December 4 and December 18. Feel free to send in questions to support@reindicator.com in advance. That is tracked literally every hour of working hours, and we would be very happy to receive advance questions and make sure we address them on the call as well. Okay, so hopefully there'll be some folks who have some questions that they might want to share with everybody, and be looking forward to having that added to this webinar today. So please post your questions or raise your hand to speak. I wanted to talk about the things I had written down as a result of the conversation we had. It was actually not 2 weeks ago, but last week on Monday on our last webinar. One of the things I had said I wanted to do for you was to present to you the 5 most and the 5 least volatile markets as we look at the classifications of markets by market size. So we have primary markets, we have secondary markets, we have tertiary markets, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that. So I did that research. I have some numbers. one of the things that we're doing right now is using a system that you see now, which allows me to run these webinars. It allows me to see your questions and answer your questions and all the stuff that's been working. But what is not working, and I don't know why, and I can't seem to change the way it behaves, is it will not allow me to display past what I've been able to show. So if I have like an Excel file or a PDF or something, for whatever reason, no matter what I do, no matter how I follow the instructions, it's not letting me with this system show that. So short of being able to fix that hiccup or glitch, we may switch over to a different system. It'll be just as easy for you to use so that we can be more capable, more able to display the types of things that I'm about to discuss. So I mentioned a little bit ago, for those who were on early, you might want to get a pencil and paper or some sort of recording device, whether it's your own computer where you take notes or whatever, because I will have to call off these markets. I'll do it slowly so that people can keep up with me. But in the future, the plan would be sometime later this year, after we're past the big data update that we're about to do. We're calling it 3.1. And since we're in the depth of that right now, I want to redivert our attention to the way the webinar functions until we complete this update. So in the meantime, so you could just bear with this. I can still provide you with the information by discussing it here on the webinar, and then at some point we'll be able to share it more live. So what we're talking about here is volatility and market size, and they're two very important ideas. The idea of volatility, this is really a way for us to express how markets, some tend to be big ups and big downs, and others tend to be, slower or less up and down. They're more stable, if you will, where others go up a lot and come down a lot. And there are reasons why certain markets are stable and others are less stable. What's interesting is that when you look particularly at the more primary and secondary markets, and we'll talk a little bit about those classifications in a moment. But when you look at these somewhat larger markets and the largest markets in the US, they tend to be a little more on the stable side. And that's because it's really kind of hard for a very large object to be disturbed, if you will. So if we're looking at volatility and we're looking for, like, for example, let's just take a value of population increase or decrease, or we're looking at job increase or decrease. What we're looking at there then is you have to have a very large number of change to change something that's very big, but you could have a very large change with a number that's much smaller. So for example, if Amazon, to not favor any particular company, but at the top of the alphabet, decides to open a job facility of some kind, any kind, of 500 jobs, if they go to a smaller market, not to pick on any particular market, but if they go to a market of a smaller size, let's say a St. Cloud, Minnesota, that would be a huge impact on that market. Whereas that same 500 going into a Las Vegas or a Los Angeles would be far less impactful. So the idea is that the volatility, it's a little hard for volatility to really be the same thing in a primary as it is in a tertiary, but the concept is the same. So if you compare the primaries to each other and the secondaries within each other, you get more of a sense of it. And what we've discovered is that some of the markets that are more volatile and less volatile, each of these categories, helps explain things like why sometimes cap rates seem to be ridiculously low. In markets, they may not be, you may never see them classified as an emerging market. They may never reach that status. It doesn't mean they're a bad market. It just means they don't have a lot of huge upside and momentum. And for a duration of time, then it doesn't mean that we would not necessarily ignore that market, particularly if it's a market in our backyard. So when we have the more stable markets where the cap rates tend to be a little bit lower or compressed, as they say in the broker's language, you might actually have a market that's worth paying a considerable attention to if it's your backyard, because it may give you a sense of the fact that there are limiting factors in that marketplace that are artificially appreciating those values when the cap rates are that low and people are paying a little more per door for them than you might expect. It might mean because the market overall has suggested over time that you do have a little more opportunity, not necessarily with rents by themselves, but just over time, your appreciation can eventually pick up enough growth that it may be an attractive investment. And a market that I've seen that's on that list that I've seen on that list, one in particular I think about fairly often, actually has some hemmed in geographic constraints. It's not a major job producer for new. It's not attracting a whole lot of new, but what's there isn't going anywhere anytime soon. It's very stable, has a high quality of life, but there are limits to where things can be constructed. So older things tend to be what's available as opposed to just building something brand new. And they tend to have a little bit higher value. Therefore, their cap rates are a bit lower. And it's a bit frustrating for us because we do need those cap rates to be a bit higher usually to get the returns that we're looking for. But anyway, that might help you understand a little better about what we're trying to reveal with this. So I'm going to look on my side here so I can call these off for you. I'm going to give you 3 on each side. I said top 5, but since we have so many categories, would take too long to review these. So let's look at the top 3 for primary markets, secondary markets, and tertiary markets, et cetera. So the primary markets are the really big ones. These are your 2 million, 3 million, 5 million, huge metropolitan areas, and they tend to have a lot less volatility overall. But as a group, if you just look at them by themselves, the 3 at the top of the list, the ones that tend to have the bigger ups and down swings are number 1, Phoenix, number 2, Riverside, San Bernardino, and number 3, Seattle. That's not surprising. We hear a lot about these markets in the news. When we had the last crash of 2008 and thereafter, we heard a lot about Phoenix and Riverside, San Bernardino having housing markets that were very overextended. So I'm really not surprised to see these up here. Very interestingly, just as a case here, Atlanta also had a lot of that problem in 2008. It happens to be number 4 for their most volatile on that grouping. At the bottom of the list for primaries are Chicago, Philadelphia, and the Newark, New Jersey markets. And again, just one more bonus one because I live there and it seems to be a very important market when people are looking at opportunities when we come out of a recession. Number 4, Washington's metropolitan area, Washington, Arlington, Alexandria, if you want to be really technical. So again, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and then the sort of bonus there, number 4 of Washington, D.C. So those are markets when they're less volatile, that it's a little easier to justify paying a little more, especially if it's in your backyard, especially if you're looking for a longer term hold. Again, I can't give you advice, so to speak, but I'm giving you sort of insight that data reveals. I'm just going to quickly check back here to see if there's any questions as we go. All right, let's pop over then to our next item. For those who have not noticed it already, there's a poll that we're going to do later on today in the webinar. So here are the secondary markets. First thing that people ask when they say, okay, secondary markets, what do you mean? What's the difference between primary market and secondary market? Well, there are no official 100% agreed to classifications for primary and secondary and tertiary and et cetera. People generally have a sense, they all kind of agree on basic principles. The primaries are the largest markets, the secondaries are the markets that get the second wave of attention. That generally speaking, it's really unlikely for a tertiary market to attract international investors. The tertiaries are the last to grow in an economic boom because the institutional investors finally can't find what they're looking for from the primaries and secondaries, so they go looking in the tertiaries. So there's a whole sort of philosophy involved with the primary, secondary, tertiary. But the difference between one being a primary and the next one being a secondary is really hard to get a concurrence on. But there is one element to it that is generally followed, which is that the very large primary markets oftentimes have what are referred to as secondary subsets of markets in their satellite. So very interestingly and very excitingly, we have drilled into that here at REIndicator, and we have found a way to reveal some of that to you so that when we get the new data release coming out in our next version, 3.1, very soon, we will be able to give you those sub-markets as well. So instead of just looking at Chicago all by itself, we'll be able to see the different little packages, if you will, that make up the individual pieces of Chicago as a much more comprehensive collective. So that means that when we look at the secondary markets, we're looking at sort of a combination of the secondary satellite subgroupings around the big markets, and we're looking at some of the more prominent markets that just aren't quite big enough to be considered primary. And you could argue all day long why a market should be called primary or secondary or one way or the other. And everyone who ever makes those arguments is entirely right, because they're getting to decide what it is. This is not a federal rule. There is no one source that dictates this. So it is somewhat subjective. However, I have taken a fair amount of time to not only research and discuss this sort of in my head back and forth, if you will, but I have taken it into consideration from sources and influences in the commercial real estate sector specifically. So this is really trying to help us in commercial real estate, help us in multifamilies. So there are markets that may be population-wise large enough to be considered primary, but because of dynamics inside the market, they're not having as many trades, they're not as prominent, they're not attracting as much international attention or maybe quite as much institutional attention. So we'll call them secondary. And the same thing could happen, that secondaries might be considered tertiary as a result of not meeting all of that sort of volume and attention. So that's a little bit about market sizes. And you're going to see these in your system. When you click on a market and get a summary, you're going to get the classification for it. And because we're adding these sub-markets, if you will, inside many of the major metros, we're going to be able to give you a whole new set of data in the markets that are the pop-ups. All that data is getting refreshed. I'm building it currently right now. I have files open on my desktop that are helping me to finalize that. So our secondaries, the top three secondaries that are the most volatile, they have the most ups and downs and kind of flexibility. It's not surprising to me that there's really kind of two themes here. Number one is the suburban Boston markets have a lot more flexibility or fluctuation with them. There's a whole range of them. The Lynn Marblehead subdivision, when you're out in Newburyport and Amesbury, that as a group, and interestingly, Brockton, Bridgewater area, those are all in the Boston secondary markets. They're all, and there's several more right near them that are also in the more flexible realm. The second one on the list, though, is Las Vegas. I'm not surprised. It has had its tough times recovering from economic challenges of 2008, so it's not surprising. Among the least volatile among the secondaries, the bottom of the list for that is Pittsburgh, and second bottom is St. Louis, and third bottom is Cincinnati. And I refer to these as the steady eddies. These are markets that just don't have the international attraction. They don't have the forward growth momentum, but they also aren't necessarily in bad condition either. So these markets will have artificially compressed cap rates. So just be careful and look a little harder for that deal that works really, really well, and don't overpay. But if they're in your backyard, you shouldn't ignore them. All right, tertiary markets. The three that are the most volatile include Merced, California, Yuma, Arizona, and Prescott, Arizona. So these are very, I wouldn't quite call them remote, but distant from the big downtowns. And they're relatively small, so it's easy for them to have a jolt make them both positive or negative. Interestingly, on this list, we have a fair number of markets that have some college representation as a major player in the economy, so that's also sort of not surprising. But at the bottom of the list for the tertiaries, it's a very large group of tertiaries. Cleveland. Again, some people might want to count that as a secondary market, but due to size and other dynamics, we've classified it as a tertiary. Albany in New York and Birmingham in Alabama. So these are markets where you're going to see that there's an attraction to the market for stability. What's there isn't leaving, and it tends to have a strength to it that allows people who are selling something to say, yeah, I'm going to charge a little higher, almost for the peace of mind, because it's not volatile. It's not going down a great amount if there are challenges in the marketplace. And then actually the one market that I keep in my mind is a great barometer of that. Before I even did the data, I was pleased that the model had borne out that it came out, I think, number 7 here if I'm counting right, or number 8 if I'm counting properly, of the tertiaries that are least volatile. Now, there's another classification. I'm just going to check in on everybody here in case there's a question or thought that I haven't seen yet. Okay, I have a question from Matt. What was the third most volatile for secondary? Okay, let me get that to you. So basically, there's a whole group of Boston markets that are in that third most for the secondaries. And I'll go back up to that list just to give you a sense of what they are. The first one on that would be the Lynn and Marblehead, which is the sort of north and east of downtown Boston. And then we have the Haverhill, Newburyport, Amesbury. Those are technically it. Also sort of to the south, we have Brockton and I'm sure I'm not saying it right, Taunton, Middleborough. Those are to the south. So generally speaking, almost most of the big secondary markets in the Boston area are very high on the volatile list. It's a little surprised by that when I saw that, but I'm not surprised by Las Vegas at all. So Austin is also in the top 10 or so. So it's not surprising that markets that have these big bursts in them of activity have this sense of volatility with them. I hope that answers the question directly for you, Matt. If it didn't, please let me know. So the fourth category is not a category I see anybody else talking about, but I, again, created these classifications of markets into primary, secondary, and tertiary, following a lot of the combined ideas, as well as what's very among economists, but specifically within the commercial real estate multifamily mindset. So it was important to me that I give you as much of that as possible. As you know, it can be a lot harder to get stuff happening in these big primary markets because of the broker networks and the bigger deals that are there, and a lot of bigger players are there. A lot of the bigger operators are already very well entrenched, and it's sometimes challenging in these larger primary and more popular secondary markets to get brokers to give you the time of day. But I should encourage you, especially when you're looking at the smaller properties and the smaller boutique firms that and firms like Gray Steel that tend to be in some of the quite a number of the more attractive primary markets, but tend to work much more heavily on the B- and C assets, that you really can still break into these markets, especially if in your backyard. It's a great place to get your teeth cut on this. But one of the things that we've been talking about is, since I am an RE mentor student and have been trained with a coach through that process, just like many of you are, I like to think of the emerging markets, if you will, as being markets that have the airport and the 2+ years of growth. But we also have a sort of a cutoff of around 200,000 in population. And the challenge is if you get to a market that's much smaller than that, 100,000, 150,000, 75,000, it's really hard not only to find product in the first place because they're relatively small towns and therefore there's not a lot of apartments to begin with, never mind that are available for sale right now. But when you get ready to sell, most people aren't looking there. They're looking in the primary, the secondary, and to some degree the tertiary markets for those opportunities. So you can't really sell on your own timeline, your own terms. So if you buy in the smaller tertiary or smaller than that, you're really wanting to think of it more as, I'll hold this as long as things make sense, and maybe a lot longer past that point because I don't really have the ability to sell it at whim. Certainly not in a rapid capacity, even if you have a really attractive price on it, because it's just people aren't looking. So if the store is empty, how do you have any sales? If nobody's looking, how do you have any sales? So the idea here is that if you're in the below 200,000, you really want to be very, very cautious, if not just ignore altogether, unless it's in your backyard or you really want a legacy opportunity, or you're thinking that it doesn't matter when you sell it. But most of you, what you're looking for is a product that you can buy, improve in value, improve in management, sell in a fairly reasonable window of time, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. You want to get out so that you can prove to your investors that you've been successful. That's the whole value of building a big a business model on your end, is not just buy one property forever and kick your feet up, but to be able to trade it in and trade it up and show your investor partners that you've accomplished something, that you've followed through on what you had expected to do on that property. You've met your goals or maybe even exceeded them. Let's hope you exceeded them. And then you can attract them into another capable opportunity that you have sourced. So if you're below 200,000, you're probably not going to have as much of that going on. And I wanted to flag that to you so that you knew if the market you were looking at or the market you were living in was of that much smaller size where you didn't have that opportunity, you'd know it much more clearly. So I've created a classification that's not used by brokers. It's not used oftentimes in conversations in this arena that I think might help a lot of people understand this phenomenon. I call them, if you look up primary, secondary, tertiary, the next thing that they use mathematically is quaternary. Not like quarter as in R before the T, but no R before the T. It's quaternary is how they say it. And this is a group of markets that you really only want to play in if you are really wanting to own it long-term and not expect to sell it. Now, if we list all 400 and something markets and sub-markets together as a group and then rank them by volatility, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, number 10, number 11, number 12, number 14, they're all at the top of the list for volatility in the whole of all markets, as well as they are obviously the top of the quaternary list as well, because they're very small markets. They're very subject to little flashes in the pan. So these are also a reason to be very cautious when you get into quaternaries. So we've talked about these before because we did have a conversation in a previous webinar about the top in the US. And it's why we have taken the time to go looking at them separately as primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. Number 1, Manhattan, Kansas. Number 2, Kokomo, Indiana. And number 3, the Villages in Florida, a very retirement centered community in north central, slightly western Florida. It's northeast of Tampa, St. Pete. It's northwest of Orlando. It's south of Gainesville. And it is a very interesting growth spot. It's the fastest growing market in the whole US. But again, it's really small. So you add 1,000 to the Villages, you see huge gains. If you add 1,000 to Orlando, you see almost nothing. It's a drop in the bucket. But that's interesting. So very small markets at the top of the list that we've been talking about before. And then the small markets that are not as volatile. The least volatile tiny markets, if you want to use that phrase, for the quaternaries are Waterloo, Cedar Falls, Iowa. Now, by the way, if you live in these markets, you might still want to try to talk to brokers. I'm not saying that they're necessarily not places to try to get experience in your field, but they are definitely places where you do want to be very careful when you think about actually following through with an acquisition. Waterloo, Cedar Falls, Iowa, Alexandria, Louisiana, and Jefferson City in Missouri are your 3 that are on that list for the least volatile among these smaller markets. So hopefully that is insightful and revealing to you. Glad to have brought those to you. In the future, my goal is in the display you have here, you've got a little webinar, webinars replays button. We're going to be adding a support button. And not only will it allow you to get to things like how-to videos and on-location videos and things like that, but I'm also hoping to be able to put up like PDFs of these kinds of lists from the webinars. And I'm also looking at ways to create like a little library up there for everybody, as well as when we do the webinar replays, I'm thinking about trying to find a way to post the PDFs of things that we have discussed on the webinar. So looking to keep expanding in that realm. Now, I like to try to take notes when I'm on the webinar for things that we've been discussing that I need to follow through on my end. I did say on our last webinar that my intent was that we were going to look at a recession recovery model so that we could see which markets have gained back the largest percentage of jobs. So they're 90% recovered, they're 80% recovered, they're 105% recovered. I still can do that, but because I took sort of a little bit of a dive into what became a rabbit hole to create these submarkets within the major metros, I wasn't able to actually get that completed for our discussion here today, but it's still on my list. And because of where we're at, we certainly will have that on our webinar next time in 2 weeks, Friday, October 9th. I also said the last item I had on my list of to-dos was to take a look at the emerging markets again so that we could have a clearer sense of whether or not the model will allow us to use an emerging markets that is a month sensitive device as opposed to just an entire annual year every December. So can I compare the Augusts from 2 years in a row? And I believe the math is showing that I can. I just don't know whether or not the numbers that are coming out are insightful and valid. So I definitely want to pursue that more vigorously for you all. And I will have a definitive on that for you on our next webinar on October 9th. Our October 9th webinar might be a little bit longer than the usual one because we hopefully by then will also be able to go over some of the new data that's in the system for you all. So that delivers from my end what I had tried to put together for you on this webinar. The last thing on the list that we normally cover includes a discussion of the economy. But before we do that, why don't we take a little bit of a side trip, if you will, into the polls. Everybody should see here in their panel that there is a polls button and there's a red dot on it. And if you all could just take a moment to look at that and see which of these devices we put into the system has been your favorite of them all. We've got a fair number of people who looks like have already voted on this. Thank you for doing that. I guess we can just get rid of the zip code overlays and the satellite views because nobody's voted it their favorite. No, I'm just kidding. It's helpful for us to know what you all are getting the most out of. The emerging markets maps, great. That seems to be #1 right now. So if you haven't already voted in the poll, I encourage you to make a choice from that so that we get a sense of what people are using the system the most for and the most valuable, because that'll give us something to put the most focus in time on our end. And as we develop the interface, as we develop the data sets, as we develop learning materials for them, we'll make sure that that topic is particularly popular. We have a little bit of change in here. It looks like we now have a neck and neck between the neighborhood scores and the emerging markets maps. That's very interesting. We are going to be giving you a new capability with the emerging markets. You're going to be able to go back almost 30 years, and it sets up in an, if you want, you can go year by year by yourself, or you can go into an automated animation mode. So we're looking forward to releasing that. And I am finishing the processing on the neighborhood scores updates as we speak. So I'm really pleased that that will be part of our new update. I see that we have somebody who's asking to add their voice to here. David, I'm getting ready to press the check mark to accept you as a speaker. I know that it could be a few moments before it allows that to kick in. So I've said yes to David, and I'm hopefully the system will let us have his voice join us. I know it takes a few moments to have him join live. So hopefully, crossing fingers that David's still here and it still accepts it in. Crossing fingers on that. I know it can take up to a minute for that voice to be added. So David, hold on here. Hopefully it flips over for us. If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand with the speak button or put an item in the chat. Before we go to the last item, I still don't see the system acknowledging David has been accepted as a speaker. So I don't know if he had an issue there. How do I unmute? Okay, I'm not really sure about unmuting. You are not muted on this end. I have left the microphone open for everybody on this end. I'm going to make sure that there isn't anything specific. I could mute you, so that means you are unmuted at this point. It might be that your microphone, David, on your end is not turned on. I'm not sure why. Mark has a question. Nope, that's not it. So you are not marked as a mute on this end here. I have not muted you. The system has the microphone open for you. So we're hoping that your end, you have a microphone that you can adjust the setting on. That would be terrific. Okay, while David tries to get that sorted out, please do raise your hand or ask a question in the chat. And I wanted to get to the last item, which is a little bit of a discussion about where we are with the economy. As you know, we are at towards the end of a month here. So actually, interestingly, it's next Friday when we'll have the Friday's jobs report come out, which is the biggest thing that the markets generally look at. You know, where is the number of jobs in the economy? What's the unemployment rate? And that's usually the monthly bellwether that helps us really get a sense of where things are going. One of the Fed bank representatives, I think it was the Federal Reserve Bank in Richmond, has suggested that they feel the economy numerically has ended its recession. I've not heard anyone else correspond with that. Generally speaking, I think we're still looking at some very tentative rates of GDP, so I'm not sure if that could be possible at this point. It's the only person I've heard say it, but it's good to keep your ears and your thoughts out there that hopefully we are moving in that direction. But some sort of evidence to the contrary would be that the latest weekly unemployment numbers were just released. And while there was a tiny, tiny, tiny improvement in them, which is better than nothing, the challenge is that number is the 25th week in a row of record weekly unemployment, new unemployment claims. So we're not going in the right direction with that. They're more than anything we had singularly back in 2008 for weekly claims. Not a good sign going into fall, where we definitely see a little bit more activity of the coronavirus itself. I think there's upticks in over 20 states. I think the number was 26 states that are having upticks in their case rates per population, a per capita kind of measure. So I think we're still in the same place we've been for quite a long time, which is we don't really know how far along we are in our either trying to reach a bottom or floating along around the bottom of a recession or climbing our way out, and how long it's going to take to get on the other side. Clearly, we're not in the clear. We're not in the place where we want to be. We're not in a healthy, sustained, robust growth phase. And while that's not good necessarily for individuals looking for employment, and it's not good for many other factors that we're looking at economically speaking, David, I do see that you have texted something in there. So let me just finish the thought and I'll take a quick read of that. But what this means is that this is still a time for all of us to double and triple our efforts in our skills and really get good at what we do, because we still haven't really hit the spot of the market where the current owners are frustrated by the struggle they have as an owner operator. We're going to see more of those, I think. I think it's going to be a challenging winter. All indications are we're not going to have massive improvement over the next 6 months. Evictions are not legal or possible in just about every environment during the wintertime. They don't put people out in the streets when it's cold and icy and snowy and whatnot. So we're going to have backlogs of challenges. And that actually, unfortunately, as challenging and difficult it is for so many people personally, it is really part of the opportunity that allows us to maybe come in as the new owner. So I encourage you to build your relationships with your brokers, pick a market or two, stay in touch with them, be the one who is unlike all the rest, that contact them regularly without obviously being too much of a pill. Send them an interesting thing that you saw in the mail, email, send them an article you read, get to know them a little bit more about how they're handling COVID, check in with them. You know, maybe you have something you have share in common. You have kids of the same age. You have an interest or hobby of the same nature. This is a great time to be the different one. Lots of people give up. Don't be the one that gives up, because if there's not a whole lot of activity, that doesn't mean that there won't be soon. Be the one they think of when that 12 unit or 40 unit or whatever it is you're looking for comes across their desk. And because you bothered to be the person who contacted them, you bothered to underwrite and evaluate what they sent them and give them feedback. You bothered to be the different one. Then you're not a bother to them. You are the standout. So I can't say it enough. Build those relationships. Get really good at underwriting. Work with your coach. Reach out. Put in offers. Go through the process. It will make a difference. David asks, if you can't hear me, the system will not allow me to speak. If there is no unmute option on my end, I do Zoom meetings nearly every day. Yeah, I know. That's why we might actually move to Zoom, David. I've had people join verbally on this. They raise their hand to speak. I say yes to them, and it takes about a minute and they get folded in. It's the other aspect of this environment that I'm using that is not pleasing. And so we are looking at replacing this with a version of Zoom that allows us to just have much more of this kind of interaction. So I do apologize for that, David. I didn't want to pull the plug on this after putting a lot into enabling it while I was rebuilding the system. But it's very evident. I can't share the screens the way it should. And even on the screen interactively with me, it says it's about to do it. So frustrating for us. Okay, let's see what David says. I bought REIndicator in July. during UP19 September, sometime in early 2020, the market cycles disappeared. Yes, they did. And we can talk a lot about that, but let me see what else you have to say. Knowing the cycle was important to manage time in selecting market areas. Without that, we are spending time in markets that are not viable, where brokers are not willing to do or do not have listings that come close to the Trinity. Notice that some markets identified as buyer stage 1 in November 2019 are now shown as not emerging, wondering how all that happens. According to the Lindahl book, as well as the original research and writings of Dr. Muller in 1995, Understanding Real Estate, Physical and Financial Market Cycles. Great reference, everybody. Excellent. Everybody go grab that reference. Every market is emerging in one stage or another. If questions of the first subject, first one is, how does the current REIndicator software define as an emerging market? And second question is, why can't the market cycles be put back in the software, since it was a major selling point in the presentation? Excellent points, excellent things to be talking about. I'm glad you brought them up. Let's talk emerging markets first. First of all, what we generally have for emerging markets, which you saw earlier, reflects an economy that existed until we had the lockdown in March. And as the data came in for the lockdown and all the market data came in showing that every one of the markets and submarkets that we are tracking had a downturn, a negative downturn, it made it so that at that point, there was like a national reset. So we kind of have to recalibrate everything to reflect that. So if you look at the emerging markets that were available to us to understand clearly as of the last release that's still in the system for you, that reflects the pre-COVID economy. When we think about emerging markets, we oftentimes try to use a year of data to kind of say, was that a good year or a bad year for that particular market? And we have this much of a jolt in every market, and most of them have not actually come back out from, gotten back to normal, and we haven't actually had a normal recession. A normal recession is that there's a financial hiccup of some kind, large or small, and the economy kind of rotates around that situation, and people lose their jobs because they're worried about, they stop spending because they're worried about losing their job. And that lack of spending causes other people to lose their job, and you have that normal cyclical process. Instead, we had people didn't really lose their jobs in the same sense. They got temporarily laid off. They got a check from the federal government to pay them for months on end, maybe not their full salary, but almost an operable kind of an income. And so until we went into August, we weren't even in a traditional recessionary stretch. So if I were to process the data on an annual basis, I would normally do that in July. And at that point, by then, we really, and still today, don't know exactly what's going on. If I were to say a market was emerging, it would be that at this point, it's kind of like it's absorbed some of the jobs it's lost during this recession. But as we've seen, a lot of that has sort of tapered off. There doesn't seem to be a real continuation of that absorption of those lost jobs to get us kind of back to normal, if you will. So in pursuit of that idea, the way we were processing data, it wouldn't have made sense to try to say, well, ignore coronavirus, let's do our annual review, because everybody would look unfavorable. So what we're doing instead is we're taking the time and effort on our end to carefully use data, market by market, for all 437 metros that we analyze and their submarkets together, and see whether or not we could do more of a realistic month over, year over year for a month comparison, as well as back out the punch of COVID by itself. Now, here's why there's something that's really concerning about that. And a lot of this actually applies to market cycles, and there's some other issues I want to talk about with that as well. There are going to be some really fundamental changes that might emerge from COVID. For example, it might be years before we get travel and tourism to be back in play. So if, for example, let's just say I could have shown, if we just released the data, that Orlando had this, this upside that you'd call emerging. Remember, usually emerging, David Lindahl would say, from the data that he talks about and the sources he refers to, it's 2+ years of growth. So, I mean, you could maybe do that August to 2 years ago, August, to see if there's growing. But if it's way down, let's take Orlando, and tourism is way off, it's come back on some of its issues, but it may have reached its cap, and it may not be emerging much longer. It may have just kind of stabilized. If people aren't going to be going into Disney World and Universal and the same record, numbers, if they're not good, that market, there's a lot of markets that have this, Myrtle Beach, Hilton Head, Las Vegas. There's a bunch of markets out there that are very sensitive on certain industries. There are also markets that are insensitive to education, and a lot of schools haven't brought their students back for live training, and there's some of the kids are in the dorms and some aren't. And so we have those markets that are inflexible and volatile. And we don't know how retirement's going to be affected by this. We don't know how snowbirding is going to be affected or not affected by this. So maybe some of the markets down in Florida and Arizona, where we normally have people go for their seasonal migrations, that might not be happening. So I kind of just took a step back, if you will, and said, hey, let's make sure that whatever we do, it's as clear as possible and it's as documented and explained as possible, so that people don't go running off saying the map says it's an emerging market, and really what it was is, like, it is emerging from 2 years ago, and it has emerged for the year before that, but it might have kind of gotten to this weird stalled, we don't know. And I really, really hate for you to go somewhere thinking it's going to keep growing, because that's what the emerging market suggested, and it's turned into that's as good as it's going to get for a while. And so I'd rather under-report the data and not steer you in the wrong direction than give you something that's false and misleading and a hope based on just looking back in time and not really understanding the full impact of what's happened in the last 6 months. So that's a very important part about this. This is a very unusual economic downturn and upturn. This isn't the real estate prices burst. This isn't the .com economy burst. This isn't stagflation and trying to get the monetary policies in better place. This is something different, and it's tied in with people's personal health safety issues, and we can't even gather normally. So concert venues and restaurants and even markets like Washington, D.C., which has the federal government and has with a lot of universities, we're very heavily dependent on tourism and travel. The jobs that are downtown, people don't go there. 12% are occupying their offices compared to a normal environment. They're all staying home because they can. And many of them are either working from home or don't have a job anymore because they used to work in those restaurants, they used to work in those dry cleaners, et cetera, et cetera. So even a big, robust economy like DC has been heavily impacted by this and is still trying to figure out what path forward it will have. And if we just take all caution, out of the way and just use exactly what happened in every other economic recovery, we could make guesses, if you will. Certain markets will do better than others. And so I'm kind of referring to that on these webinars as an interim. And that would be that the bigger markets tend to do better. They're more diverse. They have more opportunity in them. You're better off in your backyard. But I certainly don't want to suggest to somebody who lives in one market that they ought to be trying to get on an airplane or stay in hotels and meet with people 500 miles away in what looks on historical and up to now data to maybe be an emerging market, but turned out really wasn't. Same thing with market cycles, because really, actually, when you think about it, the emerging markets is a slice in an emerging market. I mean, in a market cycles, it's a phase inside of a market cycle. Nothing in the emerging stuff is clear enough, so we can't really suggest any particular market with great conviction has advanced to or is not yet in any of these individual phases. So if we're looking at the fact that in April, every single market lost large numbers of jobs and that most of them have not even gotten back to that normal pace, never mind that there's been 6 months, so some of them should have just grown naturally. They're not growing naturally. They're growing in very weird ways. They're re-employing people in some jobs and not others, and they're re-employing and then losing them because they run out of the money from the government that had been about payroll protection. They're getting laid off. It's very uncertain. The other thing that we've done about this is by knowing that it's going to be months before there's any sort of shakeout, that we can actually present data to you that we feel is going to be valuable enough for you to take action on or to take into serious consideration, is since we knew that there was this period of time where things are just going to be kind of messy, that what we wanted to do is get you all to be more focused on the primary functions that you have on your end, which is the being able to do the underwriting clearly and convincingly on your end, being able to network with your brokers and get the opportunities and know how to analyze and interpret them. And you can continue to use your neighborhood scores to help you understand whether it's the right part of the market or not, and convey back to the broker, gee, this is a great thing, but I kind of want something that's a little bit more exposed to areas that are more stable or more, more of an upswing in the market. And we've encouraged all of the people that we're working with to focus on something in their backyard, so they're not trying to travel, they're not trying to get on an airplane or go 500 miles in their car and stay in a hotel and be in a market that may or may not continue to recover at the same rate that it has been in this very weird, very down, sideways up, weird environment. So on our end, we've taken this as an opportunity also to not just keep spitting stuff out because we think it could be very mischaracterized and very misleading, but it's also given us the opportunity to step back and reevaluate it in a way that allows us to do what we're doing, which is adding all of these submarkets, which has been part of our long-term plan anyway, so that we could look at not just Dallas-Fort Worth as one big major metro, but as two separate pieces, what's going on in Dallas versus what's going on in Fort Worth, and being able to compare them to each other and know that maybe there's one market versus the other, one side versus the other. So all the major metros that are divisioned up in that way, we're also able to do that now. And we are using the time to refresh the neighborhood data and add the model called emerging neighborhoods, which will be very valuable to you all as an indication of the parts inside the cities that are seeing signs of progressing a little more outside of its own weight, if you will. It's carrying a little more of the growth in the market than the other parts are. So we've taken the time to kind of let that larger national stuff kind of like almost like cool off a little bit. I would be very, I think, uncomfortable suggesting to you a particular market is emerging right now, because I know how you're going to translate that. You're going to say, oh, it's an emerging market. I'm all in. I better go there. I better get there. And I'm not sure that we have the data at this point that would be clearly interpretable enough to suggest that that trend is trajecting forward. In a normal market cycle, where everything's kind of just going on its normal flows, we can kind of expect things to continue in a certain way, and eventually we will. But because of COVID, because of the nature of the economic recession that's resulting from it, because we don't know quite yet whether or not there's going to be sort of a second wave, more. I know restaurants are starting to panic in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic about being able to continue to serve the same number of customers, because who's going to be sitting out on the sidewalk when it's cold? So there's still so much happening that I wouldn't really want to try to steer you in any one particular direction. I tend to go on, by the way, a sort of an abundance of caution on my end as a data analyst, as an investor myself. I try to be as cautious as possible, because I'd rather miss out on what might have been a great opportunity than have gone running after something thinking it was great and being misinformed and underinformed and misinterpret how things are going. So basically I'm saying is we really need to have a little more shakeout for this. And while that's happening, we're not sitting still. We're making it so that there is more data once we're up and going again with these cycles, and there's more information available to you. There's a new capability that's coming out by being able to do submarkets. There's a new capability that's coming out by being able to look at these emerging neighborhoods, which you won't find anywhere else. So we're taking this as the opportunity that we wanted to implement these things next year and the year after. We're doing it now so that we can get them out to you sooner and they can be more applicable to you. I think emerging neighborhoods is more applicable to you than maybe the possibility that a market, at least for looking in a rearview mirror where things have changed so much since we took those snapshots, would suggest that we're an emerging market right now, because I'm not sure that if I were to say, for example, let's look at August of 2020 versus August of 2018, and let's say that it came up as 2 years in a row of growth, that would suggest to you that for the next 3 months or 6 months or 9 months going forward, that market will continue to be classifiable as emerging. I'm not sure that the dynamics in the marketplace right now would even allow that to potentially continue to show those amounts of growth during what we seem to be facing through the next 6 months or 9 months of the economy. So I hope that helps, David. I really don't want to steer you in the wrong direction. I don't want you to have frustration with the system either, but I'd rather you spend more time on the relationship aspect with your brokers and the local aspect of how things are happening on the map, in order to make sure that I don't send people off in the wrong tangent. Nobody had any idea that this was going to happen. So, emerging markets, they're coming back. We will put them back into play when the data seems to be going the right direction. Market cycles, it's still in the system on our code. It's still there. We're ready to reactivate them. What we're actually going to be doing sometime this fall is allowing you to see the history, not just of the emerging markets, which you'll see in October, if not next week, but we're also going to do the history of the market cycles as well. So you have the data available to you to kind of get a sense of where things went up and down during the different downturns that we've had. So all of that's going to become available to you as a result of us taking this re-examination of where the effort should be put. Because we could certainly analyze the data, but I don't think it's going to give you what you want and need. Okay. So next question will have to wait. I have to jump to an asset management webinar on due diligence. You go to that, David. Please feel free to email that to us for our next call. Debbie says, thanks for the info, Scott. Certainly, I want everybody to realize that I'm just as frustrated as you all are in not being able to deliver the exact same things that we have all on our end been processing for several years. The routines everywhere are shaken up and they're frustrating. But I think what we have available to you, what we keep providing to you, continues to give you, I think, what's the most valuable at this time for you to be focused on. And we really look forward to bringing out more and more capabilities and to reactivate these models when they have the defensibility of trend lines that allows us to feel confident in them. So I hope that helps. And let me see if there's, I'm going to end the poll. I'm going to give you 1 more minute on the poll. If you haven't already cast a vote, I'll let you do that right now. We're coming up on the end of our normal webinar discussion. I really appreciate the participation. I am grateful and thankful for everybody who's joined. I can't wait for you to have the new capabilities over the next couple of weeks and months that we're rolling out. And I'm so excited that you joined us here today, and look forward to sharing more insights and reviews and such on the next webinar coming up October 9th. So mark your calendar. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. It looks like we have 50% coming in for neighborhood scores and 40% for emerging markets. Thank you very much for that. We have another item in the chat. Matt says, thanks, Scott. You're welcome. I'm very glad you could join us today. Remember that you can always go back to these and rewatch them on the webinar replays, but please do try to be here for them as a live experience, because it makes much better content for everybody who does not have the ability to be here live at this time because of their duties and responsibilities. We may try to do a weekend webinar sometime in October to add as an addition to these, just to see if there's a new audience that we can reach to make sure that everybody feels connected to the REIndicator community. With that, I'm going to wrap up for today and thank everyone for joining. Please take care of yourself, take care of your families, and enjoy the beautiful fall weather when you can. We'll see you in 2 weeks, everybody. Look for your systems to be changing. They'll probably be a little different by the time we come into this live environment next time on the 9th. So it'll appear magically, hopefully. Wave the wand. I'm just crossing fingers we can do that before we see each other again live. Talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.